What's going on, y'all? KMBest here. Muse just dropped in Marvel Snap. Let's take a look and see how this destroyer is carving up the metagame. Muse is a 3/3 with an ongoing ability that gives him +3 power for each individual location where one of your cards has been destroyed. In a way, you could call this the Hydra Stomper of Destroy. The idea here is just a very cheap guy that is very reasonably big, that is not particularly unfair, but it does have some notable disadvantages compared to Hydra Stomper because it simply doesn't scale as much as a Stomper can. Now, that also gives it a bit of a theoretically higher floor. Destroying some stuff is really not hard. You are very often going to get this to at least a 3/9 and probably a 3/12 in most decks that are reasonably going to play it. But unlike in the Hydra Stomper move lists, you do not get to do any of that stuff for free. The Hydra Stomper decks are built around putting cards down that repeatably, for no energy, are going to be able to scale upwards. With Muse, you are always playing a card in order to get his output. So it's just a much more normal version of the card. You're not getting to absurd levels, but you are getting a pretty overstated guy. The big problem is that Destroy has a million overstated guys. That's like the thing that they have access to that is good. And having a million overstated guys, sure, having another one ain't bad, but it's not the greatest thing in the world either. It's just a nice thing to have. In addition, there aren't a lot of the mid-rangey Destroy style decks that Muse really wants to go in. It wants to go in a deck that is playing Death and Mockingbird with Squirrel Girl and Killmonger and doing all that stuff, but it's typically not a very efficient way of getting points if you're going to do that, because not only are you getting hosed by Mobius M. Mobius, your biggest competitor in that space is going to be decks that are playing things that are generally going to be about the same size as the things you're playing, and also are sometimes playing Mobius themselves. And that can mean that this guy ends up in a bit of an awkward situation. What I like about Muse decks is that in as much as they are stat decks, one of their biggest competitors is typically a techno-organic virus list, and Muse decks are definitely Killmonger decks. And I really like that, but I'm just not sure they're the best things to be doing Killmonger with. The Phantom X list gets to provide a lot more output and a lot more tech coverage compared to a lot of these Muse mid-range decks. And as much as I'd like to fit him in Phantom X, I haven't found a way to actually make that make sense where he is more valuable than running one of the tech cards that is making the Phantom X list good in this metagame. So let's take a look at a couple of ways to build Muse so you can understand why, although he is a strong card individually, he isn't really showing signs of sustained success because of the decks he's in. This list is what I consider to be sort of base Muse. It's kind of the best Muse-ish deck that I've seen, and I'll give you exactly one guess as to why I think that. Ready? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It's because it's playing Mother Ascani. That's why. This is an obviously powerful card that, if you're duplicating it, becomes even more obviously powerful. Playing 2 Muses is a really strong thing to do. Being a deck that just has Killmonger in it is a good enough reason to do this kind of thing. In fact, the only thing I really don't like about this list as a Killmonger list is very often you're kind of incentivized to play your Killmongers a little bit early, but because Muse is ongoing, because Archangel is not ongoing, but like you can trigger it on the final turn of the game and it will still be good. That gives this deck a little bit more flexibility in terms of when the Killmonger is supposed to be played. Obviously, as a Death deck, as a Morgan Le Fay deck, a lot of the time you are going to be incentivized to play it early if you don't have your Venom, if you don't have your Carnage, and you need to be able to start blowing things up. But largely, this is a deck that actually, I think, has a reasonable niche in this metagame. It's just not a niche that it is going to be able to dominate. That niche is stat deck that plays Killmonger, which just means it's going to have a pretty good matchup into techno-organic virus stuff. Like, this is a deck that can go points for points with TOV and blow up some of their stuff, and that's usually just going to be enough for you to have a decent matchup in that specific situation. Where you lose out is You are not very good in a gambit unless you are playing a lot of deaths. You are not very good into the surfer deck because you have nothing that can stop them from comboing off against you. And so that leaves this deck as a sort of oddly positioned kind of thing where it feels like what it's fighting to be is what Techno-Organic Virus currently is, but by being a deck that beats Techno-Organic Virus, it doesn't maintain what TOV can bring to bear against the other decks. This doesn't have the Mobius in it to beat the Gambit decks. Rather, it can lose to opposing Mobiuses, right? This doesn't have the Shadow King in it to make the matchups closer against the versions of Surfer that you're going to be seeing running around, and because of that, it just sort of ends up really only competing in this metagame along one axis. And while I do think having a good TOV matchup is a real thing, and this is as far as these decks have been able to progress for me, where it's like I would actually kind of consider playing this, the fact that it just doesn't have the room to fit the other stuff in is what puts it below Phantom X for me. Phantom X, if we recall, is just going to be a list that is able to play Shadow King and Mobius and Killmonger and have similar point output to this list while having much more wide coverage against what other people are playing that you can actually deal with. And I think that that's just a preferable spot for me, even though this is like actually a fairly compelling way to play the deck. I think Weapon X is actually like a fairly reasonable comp for Muse. Muse is better because it's ongoing, right? So there's just going to be more draws you have where Muse is an actual card than where Weapon X is an actual card. But it's a fairly similar like early game-ish play that scales upward and does some stuff and gets to a decent amount of points when you destroy a bunch of stuff. And so it's not a surprise to see Weapon X and Muse showing up in like Dormammu type shells. These are all in my head kind of the same card, like an alternate way to play Destroy that has not really broken through into the mainstream for various reasons that are largely related to how much effort you have to go through to turn on all of these cards and how difficult it can be to do that while also answering other major threats in the metagame. But I think Phantom X is a card that is typically in that group of cards, and he has shown some ability to sort of break out of that paradigm, so it's possible they can too. Although right now, I do think the Dormammu list is basically just an alt list on the previous. The same premise is here. Like, we are going to be a deck that is good into TOV because of Killmonger. We are going to have good stats, and if anyone combos off on us, we are almost instantly dead. And I think it's probably worth talking about like what combo means in the context of Marvel Snap, because I think it's probably an inefficient way to talk about this. But basically what I'm referring to is like pretty much any deck that is going to do things that are large to you that you are not able to beat. Marvel Snap decks are really all about points, right? Like that is sort of fundamentally the axis of which Marvel Snap takes place, on which Marvel Snap takes place, I should say. And that is always going to be true to some degree. But when it's a deck like this that's like not actually meaningfully able to stop your opponents from playing points, the question becomes how easily can you remove those points from the board? And the devotion we have to have if we're going to be like a Muse Killmonger death deck to our core cards, our engine cards for this, is a little bit too high to reasonably afford playing many tech cards that are beyond the core, right? Like the reason we get to play Killmonger is because he's part of our core game plan, and that's good because he's good right now, but we don't have other ways to fit in tech cards here because the rest of this stuff is actually pretty important to the game plan, right? And we have to start making some real sacrifices. Like, do we play one less one drop? Do we cut Weapon X? Then we can play Mobius and Shadow King. And maybe that's a reasonable thing to do. But if we're going to be a Carnage Venom deck, do we even want to be a Shadow King deck? Like, are we even the right space for that to happen in? And if we're going to be a Dormammu deck, we probably don't want to be playing these cards that need to stay on the board, and we need to support. Like, there's a lot of mouths to feed here in our engine, and that is preventing us from having the space to actually address the metagame with our tech cards. The Deathbird list is kind of an old school classic, and I don't consider it particularly relevant in this metagame for a couple of notable reasons, but most of it is like, It used to be Marvel Snap used to be a game where like a free or cheap 9 or 12 power could be like the difference between winning and losing. And we just have enough like Mother Ascani stuff running around that it just kind of isn't right now. And if you're going to play a deck where you're like, I'm going to make a bunch of free, really expensive guys, you can just do that, but do it with Mother Ascani and Sasquatch and all that stuff, right? If you want to make a deck that's based around discounting expensive stuff and losing to Mobius and Mobius, just play V-Hand Gambit Sasquatch. It's just going to be better at doing that. And that's sort of the thing that you run into when you try Muse in these shells. Again, like, it's not really an issue of him. It's like, I think he's just like pretty good. But every deck you want to play to actually do something with him ends up putting in itself in a space in the metagame that other things are occupying more cleanly. They're all like halfway between TOV decks and Phantom X decks, and I don't necessarily know if their engine is generous enough in terms of allowing us to run enough cards that are off engine and tech cards. And for what it's worth, I've adopted this framing from Yu-Gi-Oh! Yu-Gi-Oh! Has like X amount of engine and then like X amount of like hand traps, which are their interaction basically. And I think that that is a pretty reasonable framing for stuff like this. We as a Muse deck have a pretty demanding engine, not just in terms of the amount of cards we have to run, but because like we talked about the energy issue comparing Muse to Hydra Stomper, we have to spend energy to make our engine work, right? Like if we're going to discount our death, we need to play cards that do that. We need to spend 2 to 3 energy on cards that do that every time we want to do it, right? Carnage, Killmonger. We need to not only spend the energy to blow the stuff up, we need to spend the energy to get it on the board. And so that leaves us with not a lot of room in the curve to play this engine, let alone room to play non-engine, let alone room in the deck to play non-engine. This is also what we run into with Phantom X, right? Like, part of me was like, what if I just take the Phantom X deck and I put Muse into it? And then I'll have a 3/12 that goes in my Phantom X deck. And I still think that's like a reasonable thing to try to do at some point in the future, maybe. But I haven't figured out a good way to make it work. Maybe someone else will figure out a way to make it work, and then like this guy will actually have a competitive home. But like you look at this and you're like, wait, where are the cards that actually make this deck good? And you see what had to be changed in order to actually deliver on being a deck that is able to play enough cards out. Like now we have to run Squirrel Girl in the Phantom X deck so we can actually turn on Muse. Muse himself is taking up a spot, and boom, there go 2 of our tech card spots. We're playing Morgan Le Fay now, so we can, like, you know, make some of it back in the future and get some extra points. And it's just like, I don't think that the Phantom X deck needs the points. Like, that's sort of my ultimate conclusion. It's like, I don't want the points. The points don't matter in this deck. It's whose line is it anyway. Everything's made up and the points don't matter. What matters is my opponent is not playing anything that matters, right? I have Phantom X that is taking out a lot of the points on their board. I have Killmonger taking out a lot of the points on their board. I have Mobius. They're not going to be able to play a lot of points on the board. I have Shadow King. If they do play a lot of points on the board and they're green power, they don't have them anymore. I want every game when I'm playing Phantom X to be about me stopping them from doing stuff and not really about my own output. I'm winning games with Phantom X where I have played a total of 30 power because I've dealt enough damage to my opponent's board state that they've played a total of 18. And I just don't feel the need for a Muse type in here. And that's a metagame consideration. Like, it's because of what the other good decks in the game are. But I do sort of think that it's just not the kind of thing that this deck is particularly interested in right now, which is a little sad because it does seem like the kind of deck that could use, you know, I'm a 3/9, I'm a 3/12. It seems like it could use that, but it has Wild Child, which is a really consistent 2/9. So if Phantom X is going to be bad Wild Child, right, like you better be damn sure you're getting it to 12 is sort of what's going on. And if we're not doing the Squirrel Girl thing, I'm not very sure we're getting it to 12. Like, really, it's only like 1 or 2 lanes. And if that's happening, like, what's the point of the guy? Last up, of course, D's Troy. Now, I have a pretty different relationship with this list than basically anyone else does, which is to say, I'm a big believer in just like not playing null if I want to actually make this list functional. Like, I've talked a lot about Show Lao in this space, right? What I'm trying out now is just like, what if instead of Show Lao, I let Muse pick up the slack on points and I was just like, I'm playing an interactive card nobody's going to play around. Right now, the hot location is Death's Domain, so this is probably, like, sick as hell right now. But I do think that, like, this is just sort of a general, like, my version of Destroy Manifesto, which is like, I'm not playing Null, I'm not playing Zola. That's not what I'm about. I'm about a like much smaller, mid-rangey kind of deck that is going to try to use like some tech card stuff, maybe like a Legion here, or that could really be like whatever you want it to be. Like you could play a Mobius in here if you wanted. I wouldn't. I think what I really want is like a tech card I play on 6, that kind of thing, and just catch people off guard with. But like basically what I'm getting at here is 5+1 on the final turn of the game. I would basically always rather be doing that than just playing a Null in one lane. Just every single time. Contesting 2 lanes is just way too important in the metagame we're in, I think. And so that is sort of the space that I've arrived at for this, where it's just like, here is my slightly more mid-rangey version of Destroy. Yeah, sometimes I'm still going to combo off, get like a 40 power Deadpool or whatever, but mostly what I'm doing is trying to figure out ways to prevent my opponents from doing something really stupid. And I think that's really what this is about here. Muse is not bad here, by the way. Like, this is just like a deck that can pretty reasonably support him, and you don't hate a 3/12 if you're playing a sort of smaller ball, null-less version of Destroy. The big thing you run into is you kind of get clapped by anyone who is playing Null, right? There's a lot of incentives to not ever go small here, because if you run into the person who's playing like Null Arnim Zola, you never beat it in a million years. But I think that in order to sort of bring Destroy into the modern era, you kind of just have to like give up on that kind of stuff. That's my basic thesis here. So Muse is not bad. It's just sort of a question of where he's supposed to go. In a different world, I could see him being the kind of thing that goes in Phantom X, but Phantom X is so engine dependent right now, or so demanding on it in engine on its own, that I think it would have to sacrifice tech cards to support Muse, and I don't think it's reasonably able to do that while maintaining the profile that allows it to be a good deck. And then the rest of the Muse decks just typically end up being like, I'm worse TOV, but I play Killmonger, so I beat TOV. And it's like, yeah, okay, but the normal TOV deck has a ton of points and is actually able to contest some of these other decks in the metagame, and you don't have that many points. You just happen to run Killmonger as part of your engine, so you get to win that matchup. And I think that's the other thing, where it's like Muse hooks into a lot of stuff that people are really hard teched against right now. Like, okay, yeah, you're going to hook into like playing death. Great. This is a Mobius meta. I just don't really understand why you're doing that. You're hooking into like playing a bunch of small things that are going to get larger. Okay, great. I'm playing Gambit. I don't understand why you're doing what you're doing, right? Like, it's just like the archetypes this guy wants to go in are not the kind of things that have the mandate of heaven right now, basically. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. I got a bunch of comments about my glasses from yesterday. A bunch of people clowning them. A surprising amount of people thought they looked good on me, so I appreciate that. I have a sort of hierarchy of them where it's like, I know what the good ones are. And yeah, I know these are my best ones. I get it. I get it. But sometimes you just want to dress like LMFAO. You know what's the worst part about it is, like, someone in the comments, multiple people made the LMFAO connection, right? When I first showed my fiance those glasses, she was like, you look like Red Foo. So it's not just you guys. All right, y'all. Have a wonderful evening. I have been KMBest, aka apparently Red Foo, and you have been phenomenal. I'll see you in the next one.